So excited to be here today for AWS Developer Innovation Day. I'm here with Srini Iragavarapu, who is Director of Software Development at Amazon Web Services. We're talking about Amazon Q Developer and agents in particular. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much for having me. Very excited to be talking to you about Amazon Q Developer and how we are working on agents and helping software developers.
At reInvent, I talked to a lot of people about AI, of course, and the topic of agents came up, but more so the topic of the software development lifecycle came up. And with generative AI, with natural language processing, we're really seeing the emergence of a new way to think about the software development lifecycle. I'm curious about your experiences over the years building software, developing technologies, and how you've had to go through the SDLC yourself, and how things are changing now, and how developers might see that in their own work in the weeks, months, and years ahead.
There was a time where I would get a specification written down as to what we need to build for an application, understand the existing code base, because you're building on top of always an existing code base of sorts. Think of what logic to use, write the code, test it, and then deploy, and then start maintaining and observing how that service is behaving. That is exactly the life cycle that we all grew up doing. That is how I built my applications as well. With the advent of generative AI, especially with Amazon Q Developer and how we've been thinking about is, look at every stage of software development lifecycle, and then bring in generative AI and agentic frameworks to help the developers in these states. As an example, right now you can ask Amazon Q Developer, provide a spec, a command, natural language command of what it should do. It will understand the code base of what you're providing as an input, what you're asking it to do. It is setting itself a goal of what it should be solving for, iterating, going through the execution loop, figuring out what it should generate, and it spits out your entire application code as well. So it kind of reduced the time from ideation to deployment and creation from, at one point of time, it would be weeks and months to almost minutes and days right now. The same thing happens now. You're maintaining the code. You've deployed it. Traditionally, you get alarms. And once you get alarms, then on-call gets on-call and starts looking for what is happening in the service and start debugging. Amazon Q Developer has something called CloudWatch Insights, where as soon as CloudWatch looks at what alarms happened, through generative AI and the agent that we have, it can dig into where the issue is happening, suggest to the developers how they could resolve the issue, and in fact, sometimes resolve the issues as well. So it is improving the speed at which you're maintaining, creating applications, and solving customer problems.
A phrase we hear more of these days, and it's really interesting, I think, when you think about it, is this concept of undifferentiated work. What does that mean to you?
One of the good examples that we talk about quite a lot is language upgrades and migrations that happen. Everybody's going through, we have Java 8 legacy code, Java 11 code that needs to be modernized and migrated. Traditionally, the way this would happen is you would assign a team of developers to go look into the existing code. Either they know the code base already, or they have to learn the existing code, and then make the transitions, test it, and deploy it. That is the work. Nothing creative about it. You have to understand the new framework and the new language model. That's pretty much it. Versus, with the Amazon Q Developer Transformation Agent right now, all you have to do is ask Q to look at the old Java 8 and 11 code base, and then actually migrates it to Java 17. This is completely, there is nothing creative about it, but something that we have to be doing to keep the software up and running. Amazon internally used this agent as well. In fact, we migrated 30,000 production applications from old version of Java to the latest versions of Java, and we deployed them, saving $260 million a year approximately, both because of the upgraded versions of JDK and Java versions, and also the cost savings that I actually ended up having migrating this to. That is the undifferentiated work. The second, quickly I'll talk about too, is tests. As you write code, there is, of course, test-driven development. There is also the other way of writing. Again, it's a personal choice. It's how the developers do this. but you have to keep up with writing integration tests, writing unit tests, so that the code is always current and working really well.
Right.
With the test agent that we announced and at reInvent, Q Developer can look at your code base based on the natural language commands, give you tests so that you can use that in your code base as well.
Take us back to the first days of Amazon Q. And Amazon Q actually has some different capabilities. Developers want, right? Tell us about those first days about Developer, Amazon Q Developer, and where we are today and going forward.
When we started Amazon Q Developer, we started with inline code completions. Every developer was using the IDE, whether it's VS Code or JetBrains. They already are used to IntelliSense, providing with some recommendations. Leveraging the power of generative AI and Bedrock as a platform that we have, we were able to start providing better recommendations, faster code completions too. Like, there is companies who have adopted that version of Q Developer at that point of time and started seeing British Telecom as an example, saw 37% acceptance rates in their code bases, which means they're actually accepting the code that Q Developer is generating to be able to do that. That was the first early version. As time progressed, and in Bedrock, we started bringing in multiple different models, different foundation models, all the way from Amazon's own Nova model to Anthropic's Claude models as well. What happened is these models, generative foundation models, became very powerful. Different sizes, different capabilities, different tasks. That is when we started evolving and started looking at every step of the software development cycle. Started first with inline code completions, then being able to converse with Q, ask questions, and come back with answers, rather than you having to search in a different place and then write code. You could ask Q Developer, it will give you recommendations, and you start writing code as well. Then we started moving into the agentic framework of goal-oriented tasks. Start with software development as an example, code reviews, writing tests, and migrations as well. That's the 4 stages that we kind of went through in the last couple of years.
The agents can work with any type of complexity in the code. Is there a limitation on that complexity that they can understand and manage so they can do that undifferentiated work? Or do you have to start the process earlier so it can adapt and the developer can help it adapt to their needs?
There is always human in the loop in this picture, because ultimately the developer or the technician who's using this tool is the one who's deciding what to use and how to use it. The decision making stays there, and that's the ideation piece of the puzzle. But at the same time, these agents are very powerful. They can actually understand the existing code base very completely and be able to have the reasoning built into them as well. Not only are we using generative AI, I do want to call out that Amazon is leveraging automated reasoning in the foray of how we are setting things up, because this is where we're able to validate and test whether it's code generation that is happening. And with the slew of knowledge that we have about AWS and AWS services, we're able to build the connections of the correctness around the code bases, how it is operating as well. So these agents are very powerful. They can communicate, they go iterate. In fact, when software development agent was announced last year, there is a public verified data set called SweBench. This is a set of GitHub issues that used as a data set to validate how correct these agents are. Last year, when we launched this software development agent, we were at a 25% issue resolution task. As of last reInvent, with multiple iterations, we're able to resolve 60% of those issues right now. And the leader bench, we are on the leader bench for SweBench as well. That is just an example, one data set that we are able to do this. So the agents are actually getting smarter as we are adding more complexity, reasoning capabilities, how they're able to test the code, because it's not just about generating the code. Is the code executable? Can you test it and make sure that it is valid and verifiable? We are adding that complexity into the agents that we're building as well.
The code that's getting generated, increasingly it's done by machines. The code is actually getting generated far more than machines. I expect, I think I've seen some predictions that it'll continue that way for, as long as we can tell. Does that require more advancements in Q itself as more code gets generated? Do the agents adapt? How will the developers know that their agents are keeping up with this complex code that is continually being developed in a generative fashion?
There's multiple phases to this of sorts. There is going back to the human in the loop, the developers or the technician is actually deciding how to do this. So there is a feedback loop that is coming in. When, as an example, right now with Q Developer, if you ask a question and ask the agent to generate code for you, you can actually tell it, hey, guess what? I don't like what you generated. Could you do a better job? And then Q Developer's agent understands the feedback and is able to reiterate and regenerate the code as well. So there is the feedback loop and the mechanism that is happening. That is one piece of the puzzle. The second piece that we are bringing to the table is automated reasoning or static analysis or program analysis, as a matter of fact. Like mathematically, is this a correct output that is being generated or not? Integrations of that level beyond just the foundational model is where we are innovating right now.
Explain that again, that innovation and where it's going. I'd like to hear more what you mean by that.
The multiple layers of innovation happening in AWS world.
And is that because of the capability of the models themselves to be able to work in parallel processing to some degree as well, where you can adapt the technologies faster?
Yes. This goes back to the bedrock as a platform layer that we have. If you go back in history, 6 months, history these days is not really decades, it's actually a few days and weeks, it's changing. A few months ago, the models that Bedrock had versus the models that it can support right now, it's a long list of them. And each of them have different sizes, different latency propositions, what can do and what it can do. And because of that democratization that we are bringing to the table, applications like Q Developer or Q Business are built on top of it. What we are actually doing beyond going with just the models is the other scientific innovation, which is going back to the automated reasoning pieces, the program analysis pieces I broadly call it scaffolding. So there is the foundational model, which are all getting powerful. The compute that we have is also getting powerful, faster, cheaper for us to be able to do a lot more with powerful models. And then there is the scaffolding layer that we have, be it the guardrails that we put in place, be it the program analysis, static analysis, all the type checks that we have to improve the quality, the RAG systems that we build, the retrieval agents where data is fed in that feed into the models. Bedrock has a knowledge base where you can ingest data and be relying on that as well.
You talked about that scaffolding before, and beforehand we had a conversation about verification overload, and the issue that comes with everything is suggested because Amazon Q doesn't want to make up your mind for you, right? It can't, yep. Right? But how do you deal with the verification overload? How's that scaffolding story that you were beginning to talk about pertain?
There's multiple things that we're doing to make sure. So one, these generative AI models, and they actually are very smart. You ask a question, they will spit out a lot of answers. And what you're alluding to is, how do you ensure that what you asked and what I'm really looking for is accurate or not? There is still the last stage is where the developer himself or herself is actually deciding what needs to get in there. So there is the human in the loop aspect that continues to happen. But because these agents are becoming autonomous and we're actually letting that happen too, we are building in hooks in there. Like one of the examples is, when you generate tests or when you generate code through the software agent, we are actually creating more tests and executing them. And if it fails, we will recreate the code as well. So if you go through the transformation agent lifecycle right now, it takes a few minutes for it to transform a small repo of Java 18.11 to 17. It's not just asking the model to go transform from one language to another. What it is actually doing is transform, update the tests, execute the tests, see if the tests are passing. If the tests are not passing, feed the data as to why they are not passing into the model, and then recreate the code, update the tests again. So it's an iterative, constant cycle. And there is one point of time where you see all the tests passing, and that's what you're providing to the user as well. That's one example. Similarly, the automated reasoning and the program analysis, verification, static checks that we have, version checks that we have. So there is a bunch of that scaffolding that happens, similar guardrails that we have. Reference tracking is something that I briefly will talk about as well. All of these models are trained on open source data. There is a lot of data out there, code that is generated out there with different licenses as well. So one of the things that Q Developer does, we started doing this in the early days, is if the model generates or if the service generates code that is a similar match to something out there in the public repo, we attribute it to the source as well, just so that you as a developer could choose to use it or not. So there is those sorts of checks that happen, and then based on that there is filtering, bias and toxicity filters, there are responsible AI layers that we have in terms of what code is generated. All of that is packaged into the agents that we have right now.
So we've talked a lot about the developer experience, maybe not explicitly calling it the developer experience, but a lot of what you're talking about is the developer experience itself. The developer experience is transforming. How do you see it continuing to transform? How will it show in the developer's work?
A few recent examples which kind of caught my attention too. We had a new developer who joined our team, and she came from college, undergrad, and then, which means no industry experience, new to the industry. Traditionally, what ends up happening is when some developer like this joins, you give them a bunch of documentation, you assign them a peer buddy, and say understand the code base, shadow them for a while, and then assign them with small tasks. And then after a month or two, they're completely onboarded to writing and improving the productivity, right? Instead, in her case, what ended up happening was she leveraged Q and asked Q, can you explain this code base to me? Q Developer was able to do that with a bunch of repos. And then we assigned her a bunch of tasks, and she was able to pick up the tasks right away and actually leverage Q Developer to write code and write tests. Then you learn faster. And she hit the ground running right away. And there's multiple instances of where developers are able to onboard to getting things done faster. That's one end of the spectrum. The other end of the spectrum is there is a senior set of developers that are in there. They know the code base. They don't need explanation at all. Or they know what services are deployed where. What they are able to do is move much, much faster. In fact, one of the funny anecdotes that I have is the releases that we did for reInvent. In a way, I would attribute it to us being able to launch all of them on time with Q Developer. The reason is the developers who actually built these applications leverage Q Developer to write tests, write code, and test them, and then review them as well.
That's really awesome stuff. I guess my last question is about the underlying infrastructure that you've been developing based upon Bedrock. And when you talk about that junior developer, you talk about that senior developer, when you talk about the developer experience, I keep thinking about the approach and the philosophy that AWS has really built into its core approach, and that's being agnostic to some extent. How do you feel about that agnostic approach, and how do you feel about it, how it's going to affect developers over the next many, many years?
There is a core tenets that we have been adhering to for the longest time, and that's kind of what makes AWS, all the way from our responsible AI tenets to our service level availabilities, the quality that we bring, the customer obsession that we have. That has been in the DNA that's traditionally everywhere, whether it's Bedrock or whether it's Q Developer or something that we will always adhere to. The other one that you touched on is the democratization of these services. With SageMaker at one point of time, we said there is any model, any infrastructure, any instance, you as a customer gets to choose it. The same thing that is happening with Amazon, with Bedrock as well. Any model, it's not just the Amazon Nova model that we have. You can use all the third-party models that are available there too. On the Q Developer space, that's also something that we're doing. Not really only VS Code or JetBrains, but every modality that we're going to. So you as a developer, one, there is AWS goodness that is coming, which comes for free without us having to, because that's in our DNA. That's kind of how I wake up every day thinking about it too. And then there is the innovation that is happening for all the problem solving that is going to continue to. So you'll see more of these tedious tasks, the uncreative ones go away, where the developers are now starting to think about a lot more creative ways of solving the problems for customers.
And that's the advantage that AWS has, because you also have this tremendous interconnected capability that you've built into Q Developer by being able to think about not just Q Developer, but the whole enterprise environment that a developer or a customer might be using.
Absolutely. The three layers that we talk about traditionally is the bottom stack, which is the hardware pieces. There is GPUs, there is all our own Inferentia and Trainium hardware that if you want to be hosting that, there is innovation that is happening, there is new things that are getting launched consistently. So that's something that we're constantly focusing on. The platform that we're building, Bedrock, went from zero to where it is right now in just a year, 2 years time, with multi-agent frameworks, with guardrails that it has, knowledge bases, and that's only the innovation that is continuing, and the application layer that we are also innovating on. So we're actually doing it in every stage and all the 3 layers as well, and depends on the customer use case. There are some customers who want to talk to the hardware directly, some customers leveraging Bedrock directly, and some customers leveraging the Q developer as an application on top of Bedrock.
And we know developers love that flexibility. Srini, thank you so much for taking the time to talk.
Thank you very much for having me. Wonderful chatting with you.
Thank you very much.